When Ethan Carter pushed open the door to the executive break room on the 20th floor of Innovate Tech's glass tower in downtown Seattle, his brain simply refused to process the scene unfolding 3 feet in front of him. Victoria Hayes sat in the leather recliner positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Puget Sound, her charcoal Armani blazer draped over the armrest, the silk blouse beneath unbuttoned enough to reveal what Ethan's exhausted mind couldn't reconcile with any version of reality he understood. Little Mason nestled against her chest, nursing with an intensity that sent ice through Ethan's veins, because this wasn't a bottle, wasn't the hypoallergenic formula he'd spent $200 on last week, wasn't anything remotely close to what should be happening between the CEO of a $3.2 billion company and an 8-month-old baby whose father stood frozen in the doorway like someone had just rewritten the laws of physics. Victoria's eyes lifted slowly, locking onto his without moving her head, without disturbing the baby whose small hands clutched at the fabric of her blouse with desperate familiarity. Tears streamed down her face in thick lines that carved through what remained of her makeup, mascara pooling at her jaw, and the expression she wore contained something Ethan had never seen in the 2 years he'd worked at Innovate Tech. Never glimpsed, even in passing, when she walked through the engineering floor with that trademark Ice Queen efficiency that made junior developers literally step backward into cubicles. This was raw grief, exposed need, a vulnerability so absolute it felt obscene to witness. Her lips barely moved, the words emerging as broken whispers that Ethan almost didn't hear over the blood pounding in his ears. "Please. Close the door. Lock it. I forgot to lock it." Ethan's hand found the door handle through muscle memory alone, his conscious mind still 3 steps behind what his eyes were reporting. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room, and suddenly the world condensed to this impossible tableau. This CEO, worth more than most small nations, cradling his son while tears fell onto the baby's soft curls, while Mason nursed with the kind of focused contentment Ethan hadn't witnessed in 8 months of watching his child reject every formula brand on the market. 20 minutes earlier, Ethan had been drowning in code at his desk on the 15th floor, 3 energy drinks deep into a debugging session that should have taken an hour, but had stretched into its 4th, because the legacy system integration kept throwing errors nobody could explain. The delivery deadline sat 5 hours away, immovable, because the sales team had promised the client a demo tomorrow morning, and failure wasn't an option when you worked at a company where missing deadlines got you added to the quarterly layoff spreadsheet. Mason had been with Rachel from the UX team, probably chewing on one of those silicone teething toys while she sketched wireframes, and Ethan had allowed himself to sink into the zone where code became the only reality that mattered. Looking back now, he could identify the exact moment everything shifted, though he hadn't recognized it then. Brandon had wandered past his desk around 9:15, coffee mug in hand, mentioning something about Victoria taking Mason to the 20th floor. The words had registered at surface level only, filed away as background information while Ethan wrestled with a particularly masty database query. Victoria Hayes taking his baby upstairs didn't trigger any alarms, because Mason had become the unofficial mascot of the entire engineering division, passed between developers like a good luck charm, showered with attention from people who spent most of their lives staring at screens, and welcomed the excuse to interact with something small and warm and human. But Victoria Hayes was different. Victoria Hayes was the woman who had built Innovate Tech from a seed-funded startup in a Bellevue garage into a unicorn that dominated the enterprise software space, who had fired 300 people in a single day when the Series C funding fell through, who walked into board meetings and emerged with whatever she wanted through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Victoria Hayes didn't do small talk in elevators, didn't attend the monthly happy hours, didn't interact with individual contributors beyond the occasional all-hands meeting where she delivered quarterly results with the warmth of someone reading a phone book. Ethan had never spoken directly to her, not once in 24 months, because there were 8 layers of management between a senior engineer and the CEO, and those layers existed for reasons that seemed self-evident. The realization that something was profoundly wrong had arrived gradually, building through a series of small observations that accumulated into dread. 30 minutes passed, then 45, and when Ethan finally extracted himself from the code long enough to check on Mason, Rachel said she'd handed the baby to Amanda 15 minutes ago. Amanda hadn't seen Mason in the last 20 minutes, thought maybe Brandon had him. Brandon was in a meeting. The chain of casual custody that usually worked perfectly suddenly revealed its gaps, and Ethan felt his chest constrict as he moved through the floor, asking increasingly urgent questions that all led nowhere until someone mentioned seeing Victoria head toward the executive elevator with Mason sleeping against her shoulder. The executive elevator required a key card Ethan didn't have, but the stairwell worked fine, even if it meant climbing 5 flights with his heart rate spiking not from exertion, but from the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The 20th floor was sacred territory, reserved for C-suite offices and the kind of conference rooms where acquisition deals got hammered out, and Ethan had never set foot there before today, had never needed to, because his world existed in the concrete realm of API endpoints and data structures, not strategic vision and shareholder value. The executive assistant stationed outside Victoria's office had been on the phone, barely glancing up as Ethan moved past, and he'd followed the sound of silence to the break room at the end of the hall, expecting to find Mason asleep in a portable crib, or maybe crying while Victoria tried unsuccessfully to soothe him. Not prepared for anything close to the reality that ambushed him when he opened that door. Now, standing with his back against the locked door while his son nursed from his CEO's breast, Ethan experienced a cognitive dissonance so profound it felt almost hallucinogenic. This couldn't be happening because it violated every professional boundary, every social norm, every assumption about how the world operated. But Mason's small body told a different story. The way he latched onto Victoria with the desperation of someone who'd been searching for exactly this for months, who'd been trying to tell Ethan something through 8 months of rejected formula and weight percentiles that dropped steadily toward the danger zone. Victoria kept her eyes locked on his, still crying silently, not trying to hide or justify or explain, just waiting while Mason did what babies do when they finally find what their biology demands. The minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, time becoming elastic and strange in this room where normal rules clearly didn't apply. Ethan should have been angry, should have been horrified, should have been calculating how to report this to HR or whether California law made this kidnapping or assault or some category his mind couldn't name. Instead, he felt a collision of emotions so tangled he couldn't separate them into discrete threads, couldn't process anything beyond the simple observation that his son looked more content than Ethan had ever seen him, more satisfied, more fundamentally okay. The biological impossibility of what he was witnessing finally penetrated his shock enough to form words, though they emerged hoarse and uncertain. How is this even happening? Victoria took several deep breaths before responding, her voice raw in a way that suggested she'd been crying long before Ethan opened the door. Let him finish, then I'll explain everything. I promise you'll understand, or at least I hope you will, because I know how this looks and I know what you must be thinking. So Ethan waited, sinking slowly down the door until he sat on the polished hardwood floor that probably cost more per square foot than his monthly rent, watching the impossible scene continue while his mind spun through scenarios and explanations that all fell apart under the weight of reality. Victoria was his boss, technically several levels removed, but still in his chain of command. Victoria was 42 years old, according to her Wikipedia page, which he'd read when Innovate Tech's IPO made national news. Victoria was the ice queen of Silicon Valley, profiled in Forbes and Fast Company and Bloomberg, always photographed in severe black suits with her dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, never smiling, never revealing anything beyond calculated corporate messaging. This version of Victoria Hayes existed in a completely different universe, vulnerable and broken, and doing something so intimate that Ethan felt like a voyeur just by being present. But Mason was his son, and whatever was happening here demanded answers, even if those answers rewrote everything Ethan thought he understood about professional boundaries and human behavior. Mason's nursing slowed after another 10 minutes, his small body gradually relaxing into the boneless satisfaction of a completely satiated infant. Victoria adjusted her hold carefully, supporting his head with practiced ease that suggested she'd done this before, and Ethan filed that observation away, along with all the other impossible data points accumulating in his shell-shocked brain. She kept one hand cupped behind Mason's skull while she used the other to fix her blouse, movements economical and unself-conscious, and Ethan found himself looking away, even though the moment for modesty had passed somewhere around the time he'd watched his son nurse from a woman who wasn't his mother. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice carried the careful control of someone trying to hold together something that wanted desperately to shatter. This was the most important thing that ever happened to me. What just occurred in this room. I need you to understand that before anything else, before you call security or HR or whoever you're already planning to call. Ethan shifted against the door, his back aching from the awkward position, but he couldn't seem to move. Couldn't break the strange gravity of this moment. I'm not calling anyone yet. I just need to understand what the hell is going on. Victoria looked down at Mason sleeping in her arms, peaceful in a way Ethan recognized from the early days after Keisha died, when his mother had flown out from Boston and somehow gotten the baby to sleep for 4-hour stretches, despite Ethan's complete inability to manage more than 20 minutes before Mason woke screaming. Whatever had just happened had produced the kind of deep, satisfied sleep that only came when a baby's most fundamental needs had been met, and Ethan couldn't ignore that evidence, even as every other part of his brain insisted this situation demanded immediate action. I lost my daughter last week, Victoria said, the words emerging flat and dead despite the tears that hadn't stopped falling. Her name was Emma. I made it to 18 weeks this time before my body decided it couldn't support life. 4th time. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a little more of whatever hope I had left. The information landed like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything Ethan thought he knew about the woman holding his child. Victoria Hayes had always seemed more like a force of nature than an actual human being. Someone who existed on a different plane, where normal concerns about relationships and family and biological imperatives didn't apply. The idea that she'd been carrying grief this massive while running a billion-dollar company, while firing people and closing deals and projecting absolute confidence in quarterly earnings calls, seemed impossible. Until Ethan remembered his own journey through the last 8 months. How he'd coded through funerals and debugged through nightmares, and somehow kept showing up to work, even when getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. I didn't know, Ethan said, inadequate words for an inadequate moment. Nobody knew. Nobody knows anything about me beyond what Forbes publishes. I've made sure of that, kept every personal detail locked down, because showing weakness in this industry gets you destroyed. Gets you replaced by the board with someone younger and hungrier and willing to work 100 hours a week without the distraction of wanting things that normal people want. Victoria shifted Mason slightly, her movements gentle and practiced, and Ethan noticed for the first time how naturally she held him, how her body had adapted to accommodate his weight without conscious thought. The pregnancy hormones are still in my system. My body prepared for a baby that isn't coming, produced milk for a child I'll never feed. When I picked up Mason this morning, when he started fussing in that specific way babies do when they're hungry, something happened that I didn't plan or anticipate. The oxytocin flooded my system so fast, I actually felt dizzy. And suddenly my breasts were letting down milk, and Mason was rooting against my chest with this desperate urgency, and I acted on instinct instead of logic. Came up here, locked the door, and gave him what he was asking for. The clinical explanation somehow made the situation feel more surreal rather than less. Like Victoria was describing someone else's actions, some other woman who had crossed every conceivable line between appropriate and catastrophic. Ethan tried to organize his thoughts into coherent responses, but everything kept fragmenting against the image of Mason nursing with that desperate intensity, against the knowledge that his son had just received something Ethan had assumed was lost forever, when Keisha died on that operating table, while doctors shouted codes and nurses ran for equipment that arrived seconds too late. How long were you planning to do this without telling me? The question emerged harsher than Ethan intended, sharp enough that Victoria flinched. But he couldn't quite regret the tone because anger was starting to break through the shock. Righteous fury at the violation, even if the outcome had clearly benefited Mason in ways Ethan couldn't deny. I wasn't planning anything. This wasn't calculated or premeditated. I picked up your son because he was crying and everyone else was busy, and my body responded in a way I couldn't control, and suddenly we were here and it was happening, and I couldn't make myself stop because it felt like the universe was giving me one moment, one single moment to experience what I've been trying to achieve for 6 years through IVF and miscarriages and fertility specialists who keep finding new ways to tell me my body is broken. The rawness in Victoria's voice cut through Ethan's anger, exposing something underneath that looked a lot like his own grief, his own desperate scrambling to find meaning in loss that seemed senseless and cruel. Keisha had been 26 years old, healthy, excited about motherhood in that cautious way people have when they've watched friends struggle through complications and stillbirths. The pregnancy had been textbook perfect. Every checkup confirming that mother and baby were thriving, right up until the moment Keisha's blood pressure spiked during labor, and the doctors started using words like eclampsia and cerebral hemorrhage and catastrophic. Ethan had held his son for the first time while his wife died 6 feet away. Had felt Mason's tiny fingers curl around his thumb while monitors flatlined, and a doctor he'd never met before delivered the information that would detonate his entire life. 8 months later, he was still figuring out how to exist in the aftermath, still learning to breathe through the moments when grief ambushed him in grocery store aisles, or during code reviews, or at 3 a.m. when Mason woke crying for a mother who would never come. The idea that Victoria Hayes carried her own version of that devastation, had been functioning at the highest levels of corporate leadership, while bleeding internally from losses nobody else could see, created an unexpected bridge between them that had nothing to do with org charts or pay grades. "I need to take him to the pediatrician," Ethan said finally, the words emerging from some part of his brain still capable of practical thinking. "We have an appointment at 2. The doctor's been worried about his weight, about the formula rejection. I don't know what to tell her about this." Victoria nodded slowly, carefully transferring Mason to Ethan's arms without waking him, and the loss that crossed her face when the baby left her embrace was so profound Ethan had to look away. She stood with visible effort, reaching for her blazer, transforming back into the CEO with each breath, even though her eyes were still red and her mascara had created dark smears along her cheekbones. "Tell her the truth. Tell her a woman who recently miscarried, was holding your son, and experienced spontaneous lactation due to hormone fluctuations. Tell her that your son nursed for approximately 35 minutes and fell into the deepest sleep you've seen in months. Tell her whatever medical facts are relevant to his care." Ethan rose as well, cradling Mason against his chest while reaching for the door lock with his free hand. The baby's weight felt different somehow, more substantial, as if those 35 minutes had added density to his small frame. We're going to have to talk about this again, about all of this, because I still don't understand what just happened, or what it means, or what the hell I'm supposed to do with this information." Victoria met his eyes for a long moment, her expression settling back into the controlled mask Ethan recognized from company meetings, though something in her gaze remained raw and exposed. "I know. And I'll answer whatever questions you have, explain anything you need explained. But right now, take care of your son. Make sure he's healthy. That's what matters." The drive to Dr. Morrison's office passed in a blur of Seattle traffic and racing thoughts that refused to organize into coherent patterns. Ethan kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching Mason sleep in the car seat with that same profound contentment, occasionally checking to make sure this was real and not some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many energy drinks and too little sleep. The appointment had been scheduled for weeks, another in the long series of increasingly worried visits where Dr. Morrison documented Mason's failure to thrive, where percentile charts showed downward trajectories and the specter of hospitalization loomed closer with each weigh-in that came back below expectations. Dr. Morrison had delivered hundreds of babies during his 30 years at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, had seen every variation of feeding difficulty and failure to thrive, but his expression when Ethan explained what had happened suggested this particular scenario was new territory even for someone with his experience. He listened without interrupting while Ethan laid out the facts in chronological order, starting with finding Mason missing from the 15th floor and ending with Victoria's explanation about miscarriage and spontaneous lactation, trying to keep his voice clinical and detached, even though the story felt insane coming out of his own mouth. "And you're certain it was actual breastfeeding, not bottle feeding with expressed milk or formula?" Ethan shifted Mason to his other shoulder, the baby still sleeping peacefully despite being in the examination room where he usually screamed through the entire appointment. "I saw it with my own eyes. There was no bottle involved. It was direct nursing, and Mason latched on like he'd been doing it his entire life, instead of being exclusively formula-fed since birth." Dr. Morrison removed his wire-rimmed glasses, cleaning them with methodical precision that suggested he was buying time to formulate a response. His office had photographs on the walls showing him at various stages of his career, starting as a young resident in Atlanta and progressing through decades of practice that eventually brought him to California, to this pediatrics clinic where Ethan had been bringing Mason since week 2 when the first formula experiments began failing. "The medical facts are straightforward enough," Dr. Morrison said, replacing his glasses and pulling up Mason's chart on the computer. "Women who experience late-term pregnancy loss can indeed produce milk due to sustained hormone levels, particularly if they were in the second trimester or beyond. The letdown reflex can be triggered by proximity to an infant, especially one actively seeking to nurse. From a nutritional standpoint, breast milk is incomparably superior to any formula on the market, which is why the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends exclusive breastfeeding for at least 6 months whenever possible." Ethan heard the clinical information, processed it on an intellectual level, but his emotional response remained tangled and confused. "But this isn't my wife breastfeeding our son. This is my boss. Someone I don't know beyond professional interactions. Someone who just did something that feels like it should be illegal, or at minimum, completely inappropriate." Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from clinical to something more personal, more grounded in the messy realities that medical textbooks didn't adequately address. "Wet nursing has existed throughout human history, Ethan. It was standard practice for centuries, continues to be common in many cultures today. The taboo around it is relatively recent and largely cultural rather than medical. From where I sit, looking at Mason's chart and the concerning trajectory we've been tracking for months, what happened today might have been the single most nutritious and beneficial experience of his entire life so far." The words landed with unexpected weight. reframing the situation in a way Ethan hadn't considered while standing in that 20th floor break room watching his CEO cry. He'd been thinking about boundaries and appropriateness and what HR would say, not about the simple biological fact that his son had just received exactly what his body had been desperately seeking for 8 months of frustrated formula rejection. "He's never nursed this well before," Ethan admitted, looking down at Mason's peaceful face. "Keisha died before she could even try breastfeeding. We went straight to formula in the hospital, and it's been a nightmare ever since. 4 different brands, 3 different bottle types, consultations with lactation specialists who had no solutions because there was no breast milk to work with. Watching him refuse food over and over while his weight dropped has been killing me slowly. And today he nursed for half an hour like it was the most natural thing in the world." Dr. Morrison pulled up the growth charts, pointing to the curve that showed Mason hovering just above the 5th percentile for weight, dangerously close to the threshold where hospitalization became necessary. "If this woman is healthy, if she's willing, and if Mason responds as positively as it sounds like he did, then from a purely medical perspective, this could solve the feeding crisis that's been threatening his development. The question isn't whether breast milk would benefit him, because the answer to that is unequivocal. The question is whether you're comfortable with the arrangement, given the personal and professional complexities." Ethan stood pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, watching cars navigate through the mid-afternoon traffic while his brain tried to process information that seemed designed to short-circuit normal decision-making processes. Victoria Hayes had just offered his son something irreplaceable, had given Mason access to nutrition his body desperately needed through an act that was simultaneously generous and boundary-violating, selfless and strange. The fact that it had emerged from her own grief and loss made it more complicated rather than less, added layers of emotional entanglement that Ethan couldn't begin to untangle while standing in a pediatrician's office trying to figure out if his son was healthy or if this bizarre situation had just created new problems to replace the old ones. "I need to talk to her again," Ethan said finally. "Need to understand if this was a one-time thing driven by hormones and grief, or if there's something more happening here that I should be aware of." Dr. Morrison nodded, making notes in Mason's chart that would document this appointment in ways that would probably baffle any future doctors who reviewed the records. "Whatever you decide, make sure Mason continues getting adequate nutrition. His development depends on it. The feeding difficulties we've been tracking aren't sustainable long-term. Something needs to change, whether that's finding a formula that works or exploring alternative options." The drive back to Innovate Tech took 40 minutes through typical Seattle congestion, and Ethan used the time to call his mother in Boston, putting the phone on speaker while navigating through the financial district toward the glass tower that housed his office and his CEO, and the impossible situation that had detonated his understanding of professional boundaries. Margaret Thompson had raised 3 sons as a single mother in Boston's rougher neighborhoods, had worked double shifts as a hospital administrator to keep food on the table and Ethan in the magnet school that eventually earned him a scholarship to Berkeley. She'd seen him through Keisha's death, had flown out despite her heart condition, and stayed for 6 weeks helping with Mason while Ethan learned to function through grief. Her voice on the phone carried that particular tone of maternal concern that suggested she already knew something was wrong before Ethan said a word. "Baby, you sound exhausted. What's happening?" Ethan told her everything, the words spilling out in a confused rush that probably didn't make much sense, but captured the essential insanity of the day. He expected shock, maybe disapproval, possibly anger at this woman who had crossed lines without permission. What he got instead was silence, the kind of thoughtful quiet that meant his mother was actually processing instead of reacting, considering the situation from angles Ethan hadn't thought to examine. "You know your grandmother fed half the neighborhood babies back in the day," Margaret said finally, her voice carrying memories of a South Carolina childhood Ethan only knew through stories. Women helped each other raise children because that's what community meant. If your milk came in and your neighbor's baby was hungry while she was at work, you fed that child. Nobody thought twice about it, because survival mattered more than whose breast the baby was latched to. Ethan hadn't expected that response, hadn't anticipated his mother reaching for cultural memory that predated modern anxieties about appropriate boundaries. That was a different time, Mama. This is my boss we're talking about, the CEO of the company. There are power dynamics and professional concerns and 100 reasons why this could explode in my face. Margaret's laugh came dry and knowing, carrying decades of navigating white corporate America as a black woman who'd climbed from secretary to hospital administration through sheer persistence. Baby, I understand power dynamics better than you think. I also understand that your son has been slowly starving for 8 months while you tried every solution modern medicine could offer. This woman just gave Mason something you couldn't provide, something his body desperately needed, and she did it from her own grief and loss. That's not power dynamics. That's grace showing up when you least expect it. The words hit harder than Ethan wanted to admit, exposing the fear underneath his concerns about appropriateness, the shame he'd been carrying about failing to solve Mason's feeding crisis through acceptable channels. He was supposed to be the provider, the protector, the father who could handle everything, even when everything felt impossible. Accepting help from his CEO, from a woman he barely knew, from someone whose own pain had somehow intersected with his son's needs, felt like admitting defeat in ways Ethan wasn't ready to process. What if she's not stable? What if this is some grief reaction that passes and leaves Mason dependent on something that disappears? Margaret's voice softened, taking on that particular quality she used when Ethan was being stubborn about something he needed to hear. Then you figure it out the same way you've been figuring everything else out. But right now, today, your son is sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. That's not nothing, Ethan. That's everything. Don't let pride or fear or professional concerns stop you from accepting a blessing just because it comes wrapped in uncomfortable packaging. Ethan pulled into the Innovate Tech parking garage, finding his assigned spot on the 3rd level, while Mason continued sleeping in the back seat with that same profound contentment. The conversation with his mother had shifted something in his perspective, opened space for considering this situation from angles that weren't purely about boundaries and appropriateness. But accepting that shift meant having another conversation with Victoria, meant going back up to the 20th floor and asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The engineering floor felt different when Ethan returned, though probably nothing had actually changed beyond his perception of the space where he spent 60 hours a week writing code and debugging systems. Rachel asked about the appointment with casual interest, and Ethan deflected with vague statements about weight checks and formula discussions, not ready to explain the real situation to colleagues who knew Victoria Hayes only as the terrifying executive who occasionally swept through on corporate tours. The afternoon crawled past with Ethan accomplishing nothing productive, his attention fragmenting between the sleeping baby in the portable crib beside his desk and the 20 floors above where Victoria presumably sat in her corner office, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Around 5:30, as the office began its evening exodus toward the parking garage and BART stations and buses that would carry people back to apartments and houses scattered across the Bay Area, Ethan made a decision that felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. He packed up Mason's gear with mechanical precision, everything fitting into the oversized backpack that had become his constant companion, and walked to the elevator bank with his heart rate climbing toward levels usually reserved for sprint intervals or emergency room visits. The executive elevator required a key card Ethan didn't have, but the main elevator went to every floor, even if it meant enduring security protocols and checkpoints. The 20th floor reception area was emptier than it had been at 9 that morning, just Catherine at her desk outside Victoria's office, reading something on her computer with the intense focus that suggested end-of-day email processing. She looked up when Ethan approached, her expression shifting through surprise and suspicion before settling on professional neutrality. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Whitmore isn't taking meetings today." Ethan adjusted his grip on Mason, who was starting to wake from the afternoon nap that had lasted 4 hours longer than any previous sleep session in recent memory. "I think she'll want to see me. It's about this morning." Something flickered across Catherine's face. Recognition or understanding, or maybe just the awareness that whatever was happening here fell outside her job description. She picked up her phone, spoke quietly into it, listened for a moment, then gestured toward the heavy oak door that led to the corner office Ethan had only seen in company press releases. "She says to come in." Victoria's office occupied the northwest corner of the building, windows on 2 walls offering views of the Puget Sound and the fog rolling through the Golden Gate in thick banks that would blanket the city by nightfall. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, steel and glass and leather in shades of black and charcoal. No personal photographs or decorative touches, beyond a single orchid on the credenza that looked professionally maintained. Victoria sat behind her desk reviewing documents, and she didn't look up immediately when Ethan entered, didn't acknowledge his presence until he crossed half the distance to her desk and stopped, uncertain whether to sit or stand or speak first. When she finally raised her eyes, Ethan saw exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind of weariness that no amount of sleep could fix, because it came from carrying weight that never got lighter. "I thought you might come back," Victoria said, her voice flatter than it had been in the break room, more controlled, more like the CEO voice Ethan recognized from quarterly meetings. "Sit, please." Ethan settled into one of the leather chairs across from her desk, positioning Mason on his lap so the baby could see around the office, taking in the world from his father's arms with wide eyes that suggested full awareness despite being barely 8 months old. "I talked to the pediatrician and my mother, and I've been thinking about what happened this morning for the last 6 hours. Victoria closed the folder in front of her with precise movements, giving Ethan her full attention in a way that felt almost overwhelming, like standing in a spotlight that revealed every flaw and inadequacy. "And what conclusions did you reach?" Ethan took a breath, organizing thoughts that still felt jumbled and uncertain despite hours of mental processing. "That I don't understand what happened or why it happened, but I can't deny that Mason responded to you in ways he's never responded to formula. That the pediatrician confirmed breast milk would be incomparably better for his development than anything I can buy in a store. That my mother reminded me wet nursing used to be normal before modern society decided it was weird." He paused, watching Victoria's expression for reactions that remained carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "But I also need to know if this was a one-time thing driven by grief and hormones, or if there's something else happening here that I should understand before I make any decisions about my son's welfare." Victoria stood, moving to the window that overlooked the bridge, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she was holding herself together through conscious effort. "I've lost 4 babies in 6 years. 4 pregnancies that ended in different kinds of devastation, each one taking something I can't get back. Last week I lost Emma at 18 weeks after spending 4 months believing this time would be different. This time my body would cooperate. This time I'd finally get to experience motherhood instead of just failing at it repeatedly." She turned to face Ethan, and the control in her expression had started to crack, showing the grief underneath. "When I held your son this morning, when my body responded by producing milk, when he latched on and nursed like he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly that, I felt what I've been chasing for 6 years. I felt needed. I felt capable. I felt like maybe all this suffering had some purpose beyond just destroying me slowly." The honesty in her words created a space Ethan hadn't expected, an opening for something that looked almost like understanding, despite the massive gap between their lives and experiences. I can't give you guarantees about hormones or how long my body will produce milk, or whether this makes any kind of sense from a rational perspective. What I can tell you is that feeding your son today was the most important thing I've done in my entire life. More meaningful than any deal I've closed or any company I've built. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to continue. Not as your boss, not as some corporate arrangement, but as someone who desperately wants to experience at least part of motherhood, even if it's not with my own biological child. Ethan looked down at Mason, who had started reaching for his face with chubby hands, babbling nonsense syllables that were slowly developing toward actual words. 8 months of watching his son struggle had taught Ethan to recognize when Mason was thriving versus merely surviving, and the difference today was undeniable. The baby who had screamed through every formula feeding and spent hours crying from hunger his father couldn't satisfy had become calm and content after 35 minutes at Victoria's breast, had slept more peacefully than Ethan had ever witnessed, had woken alert and engaged instead of fussy and irritable. The decision forming in Ethan's mind felt insane and reckless, and completely contrary to every professional instinct he'd developed during his career. Victoria returned to her desk, sitting down with visible relief, as if Ethan's words had removed weight she'd been carrying since morning. I understand. My penthouse isn't appropriate either. Too much staff, too many security cameras, too many ways this could leak and become a story that destroys both of us. Your apartment? Ethan nodded, already thinking through logistics that felt surreal to be considering. I live in Mission District, 2-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, but it's private. You could come after work. Stay for however long Mason needs. We keep this between us until we figure out if it's sustainable. They discussed details with the same efficiency they might bring to a project kickoff meeting, establishing schedules and expectations and boundaries that felt necessary even if the entire conversation existed in territory neither of them had ever navigated before. Victoria would come by at 6 each evening, stay until Mason had nursed and fallen asleep, then leave before the situation could drift into territories that complicated an already impossible arrangement. They would maintain complete professionalism at the office, no special treatment, no acknowledgement of what was happening outside work hours. If questions arose, they would handle them honestly but carefully, protecting both Mason's well-being and their own privacy. By the time Ethan left her office, darkness had settled over Seattle completely, the city lights creating patterns that stretched toward distant hills. He carried Mason through the empty 20th floor toward the elevator, past Catherine's now vacant desk, feeling like he'd just negotiated the strangest agreement of his life. Tomorrow Victoria would show up at his apartment, would cross the threshold between professional and personal in ways that should feel threatening, but somehow didn't, would continue giving his son what Ethan couldn't provide through an arrangement that existed outside every category he understood. The drive home took him through streets he knew by heart, past the taco trucks on Mission and the murals in Clarion Alley, and the corner store where he bought emergency diapers at 2 a.m. when supplies ran low. His apartment building was nothing special, just one of 1,000 generic structures that housed the workers who kept Seattle functioning, while tech millionaires slept in Pacific Heights mansions. Ethan climbed 3 flights of stairs with Mason and the overstuffed backpack, unlocked the door to the space that had been his sanctuary and prison for the last 8 months. The place where he'd learned to change diapers and heat bottles and function on 3 hours of sleep while grief waited in every corner. That night, preparing Mason for bed with the same routine he'd followed since bringing the baby home from the hospital, Ethan noticed differences subtle enough that he might have imagined them if he weren't looking so carefully. Mason settled into sleep easier, fussed less during the diaper change, seemed generally more content in ways that probably came from having a full belly for the first time in months. Ethan sat in the rocking chair beside the crib long after Mason dozed off, watching his son sleep while processing a day that had started normally and ended somewhere completely beyond his ability to map. Tomorrow, Victoria Hayes would knock on this door, would enter his private space, would nurse his child in his living room while they figured out if this arrangement was sustainable or insane, or possibly both. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him running to HR or legal counsel or anyone who could explain why this was a catastrophically bad idea. Instead, Ethan felt something closer to cautious hope, the first genuine optimism he'd experienced since watching Mason's weight percentiles drop toward dangerous territory, while every formula brand on the market proved equally useless. He thought about Keisha, wondering what she would make of this situation, whether she'd approve or be horrified, or simply understand that sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected places. They'd talked about breastfeeding during the pregnancy, Keisha determined to try despite horror stories from friends about painful latching and inadequate supply and judgmental lactation consultants. She'd never gotten the chance, had died before holding Mason long enough to attempt feeding him. And Ethan had assumed that particular door had closed permanently the moment the monitors flatlined. Now it had opened again through the last person Ethan would have predicted, through his CEO's grief intersecting with his son's desperate needs in ways that felt almost supernatural in their timing. Victoria Hayes was suffering losses Ethan could barely comprehend, carrying pain that had accumulated over years of failed attempts to achieve what most women took for granted. She'd built an empire, had created something that would outlast her, but the one thing she actually wanted kept slipping through her fingers, no matter how much money or willpower or strategic thinking she applied. And somehow, in this impossible collision of their separate griefs and needs and failures, they'd stumbled into an arrangement that might actually work, that might solve Mason's feeding crisis while giving Victoria a taste of the motherhood she'd been chasing for 6 years. It was messy and complicated, and violated every professional boundary Ethan had been taught to maintain. It was also the first genuine solution he'd found in 8 months of watching his son suffer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own adjustments, its own moments of awkwardness and uncertainty as they figured out how to navigate this arrangement. But tonight, Mason slept peacefully in his crib, properly fed for the first time since birth, and Ethan could hear his son's steady breathing from across the room. That simple fact mattered more than organizational charts or power dynamics or concerns about what other people might think if they knew. Ethan stood, stretching muscles tight from a day spent cycling between shock and confusion and tentative hope. He checked on Mason one more time, confirming the baby's chest rose and fell with reliable rhythm, then moved to his own bedroom, where exhaustion waited to claim him. Tomorrow would start the real experiment, the first deliberate step into territory they'd stumbled into by accident. But tonight, for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, his son was truly at peace. And that was enough. Victoria arrived at Ethan's apartment at 6:15 the following evening, standing in the hallway outside his door with the tentative posture of someone entering completely foreign territory. She'd changed from the severe black suit into dark jeans and a simple cashmere sweater, her hair down for the first time Ethan had ever witnessed, falling past her shoulders in waves that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. The transformation from Ice Queen CEO to nervous woman about to cross an intimate threshold was so complete that Ethan almost didn't recognize her when he opened the door. "Come in. Mason's been fussy for the last hour. I think he knows you're coming." Victoria stepped into the cramped living room, taking in the space with eyes that probably compared it automatically to her penthouse with its panoramic views and designer furniture. Ethan's apartment was clean, but cluttered with the accumulated chaos of single fatherhood, baby gear occupying every available surface, laundry folded on the couch because the bedroom was too small for proper organization. She didn't comment on the modest surroundings, just set her bag down carefully and held out her arms when Mason started reaching for her with urgent little sounds that weren't quite crying but suggested he'd get there soon if his needs went unmet. The transition was immediate and striking. Mason settled against Victoria's chest, rooting with the same desperate focus Ethan had witnessed yesterday. And within seconds, he'd latched on and begun nursing with intensity that suggested his body remembered exactly what had happened in that 20th floor break room. Victoria sank into the rocking chair Ethan had positioned by the window, her entire frame relaxing as Mason fed, and Ethan busied himself in the kitchen area, pretending to clean dishes that were already clean, because watching this felt too intimate, despite having agreed to the arrangement. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Victoria focused entirely on Mason, while Ethan moved between kitchen and living room with manufactured tasks that kept his hands busy. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. More like the cautious quiet of two people navigating new territory without a map, figuring out boundaries through trial and error rather than explicit discussion. Eventually, Ethan ran out of things to pretend to organize and settled on the couch with his laptop, pulling up code reviews that needed completion before tomorrow's stand-up meeting. "You can relax," Victoria finally said, her voice low to avoid disturbing Mason. "I know this is strange, but we might as well accept that strange is our new normal." Ethan closed the laptop, accepting that productive work wasn't happening while his CEO nursed his son 15 feet away. "How long does your doctor think the milk will last?" "The hormones from the miscarriage." Victoria shifted slightly, adjusting Mason's position with practiced ease that suggested muscle memory was building faster than conscious skill. She wasn't sure. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. The body doesn't follow predictable timelines when it comes to pregnancy loss. Some women dry up immediately, others produce milk for months afterward. The uncertainty inherent in that answer troubled Ethan more than he wanted to admit, because if Mason became dependent on Victoria's milk only to have it disappear abruptly, they'd be back in the same crisis that had nearly required hospitalization. But voicing that concern felt ungrateful given what Victoria was offering. So Ethan filed it away along with all the other anxieties accumulating around this arrangement. "What made you pick him up yesterday? Out of all the times Mason's been at the office, you'd never shown interest before." Victoria's expression shifted, memories crossing her face that carried visible pain. "I heard him crying from my office." The sound cut through a conference call about Q3 projections, and suddenly nothing else mattered except getting to that baby. "I told the board I'd call them back and went down to the 15th floor without really thinking about why. When I picked him up, something clicked in my body that I wasn't prepared for. The oxytocin response was so overwhelming, I actually felt lightheaded." She paused, watching Mason nurse with an expression that mixed wonder and grief in equal measure. "I've held babies before, at company events when executives bring their families. It never affected me like this, never triggered anything beyond polite interest. But Mason was different. Or maybe my body was different because of Emma. Or maybe the universe just decided that particular moment was when everything would align in the worst and best possible way, simultaneously." Ethan absorbed this, adding it to his growing understanding of how grief operated, how it could ambush people in conference calls and turn ordinary moments into turning points that rewrote entire life trajectories. His own experience with loss had taught him that trauma didn't follow logical patterns, didn't restrict itself to appropriate times and places, could erupt during code reviews or grocery shopping or any random Tuesday when the weight became too much to carry alone. The evening established a pattern that would repeat with minor variations over the following weeks. Victoria would arrive around 6, nurse Mason for 30 to 45 minutes while Ethan worked on his laptop or cooked dinner, then stay another hour while the baby dozed, and they talked about topics that started professional and gradually drifted personal. She told him about growing up in Detroit, about her father who'd worked at the Ford plant until the layoffs came and took his sobriety with them, about learning to code in the public library because home wasn't safe when her father was drinking. Ethan shared his own history, the Boston neighborhoods where his mother had raised 3 boys on an administrator's salary, the basketball scholarship that got him into Berkeley when his grades alone wouldn't have been enough, meeting Keisha at Highland Hospital when he'd broken his wrist going for a rebound, and she'd been the nurse who'd wrapped his arm while teasing him about thinking he was LeBron James. By the end of the first week, the awkwardness had faded enough that they could exist in the same space without constant awareness of how bizarre this situation would look to outside observers. Mason thrived in ways that became undeniable when Ethan took him for the follow-up appointment with Dr. Morrison, and the scale showed 3 pounds gained in 7 days, a growth rate that moved him from the 5th percentile towards something approaching normal. Dr. Morrison documented the improvement with professional detachment, asking questions about feeding frequency and duration that Ethan answered honestly, while deliberately avoiding details about who was providing the milk. The second week brought the first real complication, though it arrived wrapped in such mundane packaging that Ethan almost didn't recognize it as a threat. Rachel from the UX team mentioned during a code review that she'd noticed Victoria leaving the building around the same time as Ethan several evenings in a row. Wondered aloud if they'd been assigned to some special project that required after-hours collaboration. Ethan deflected with vague statements about consulting on a personal matter, but the question planted seeds of concern about how long they could maintain this arrangement before someone noticed patterns and started asking questions that had no good answers. That evening, Ethan mentioned the conversation to Victoria while she settled into the rocking chair with Mason already rooting urgently against her shoulder. We need to be more careful about timing. People are starting to notice we leave at the same time. Victoria adjusted her sweater, helping Mason latch on while considering the problem with the same strategic thinking she probably applied to competitive analysis and market positioning. I can vary my departure time, make it less predictable. Maybe come here straight from external meetings some days, so I'm not leaving from the office at all. They worked through logistics like they were planning a product launch instead of hiding an arrangement that would probably get them both fired if HR discovered the truth. The conversation revealed how much mental energy they were both investing in maintaining secrecy, in protecting something that felt simultaneously precious and impossible to defend if anyone demanded explanations. Ethan found himself wondering how long they could sustain this level of careful coordination before exhaustion or carelessness created cracks where truth could leak through. The third week marked a shift in their relationship that Ethan noticed but couldn't quite name. Victoria started arriving earlier, staying later, finding reasons to extend the evenings beyond the strictly necessary time required for Mason to nurse. She'd help with dinner preparation, chopping vegetables while Ethan handled the stove, their movements in the cramped kitchen developing a rhythm that came from repeated practice. They'd eat together after Mason fell asleep, talking about everything from Innovate Tech's upcoming product launch to Victoria's failed IVF attempts to Ethan's memories of Keisha that were starting to hurt less sharply, even as they remained permanently tender. One Thursday evening, while Victoria washed dishes and Ethan dried, she told him about her ex-husband with a flatness that suggested she'd processed this grief long enough that it had lost its immediate sting. He left after the second miscarriage, said he couldn't watch me destroy myself chasing something that clearly wasn't meant to happen. I think he expected me to choose him over the possibility of motherhood, to accept childlessness and move on with our lives together. When I couldn't do that, when I kept pursuing fertility treatments despite the emotional and physical toll, he decided I'd made my choice. Ethan set down the plate he'd been drying, giving her his full attention because this felt important in ways that went beyond casual conversation. Did you ever regret it? choosing the treatments over the marriage? Victoria turned off the water, drying her hands on the towel with deliberate movements that bought her time to formulate an answer. Every day for the first year. Then gradually, the regret transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, but maybe understanding that some people aren't built to carry other people's grief alongside their own. He needed a partner who could compartmentalize loss, who could try for a baby and then move on when it didn't work, instead of letting each failure compound into something that consumed everything. She looked at Ethan with an expression that held both vulnerability and strength, acknowledging pain without being destroyed by it. I couldn't be that person. Can't be that person. When I want something, I pursue it with everything I have, which is probably why I built a billion-dollar company, but also why I've lost 4 pregnancies without learning when to stop trying. The honesty in her words created intimacy that had nothing to do with the physical act of nursing Mason. A different kind of closeness, built from shared understanding of what it meant to want something desperately, while watching it slip away repeatedly. Ethan recognized the pattern from his own experience with grief. The way loss didn't diminish just because time passed. How absence could become a permanent presence that shaped every decision and perspective. Keisha used to say I loved too hard, Ethan offered, the memory arriving with unexpected gentleness. That I needed to learn how to want things casually, to care less intensely so disappointment wouldn't hit as brutally. She was probably right, but I don't know how to be any other way. Victoria smiled, a real smile that transformed her face completely, erasing the Ice Queen mask to reveal someone younger and more approachable underneath. Maybe that's why we ended up here. 2 people who can't do anything halfway, who commit completely, even when the smart move would be protecting ourselves. The moment stretched between them, charged with recognition that felt dangerous in its implications. Ethan broke eye contact first, returning to the dishes with renewed focus, because acknowledging the connection forming between them meant confronting questions about where this arrangement was heading beyond the immediate practical concerns about Mason's nutrition. By the 4th week, Victoria had become such a regular presence in Ethan's apartment that Mason would start fussing around 6 o'clock, regardless of whether he was actually hungry. His internal clock apparently calibrated to expect her arrival. The baby's development had accelerated dramatically, reaching milestones that Dr. Morrison documented with professional satisfaction, while carefully avoiding questions about the specifics of Mason's feeding routine. Ethan watched his son transform from the listless infant who'd barely responded to stimulation into an engaged, alert baby who smiled readily and babbled constantly, reaching for toys with improving coordination and sleeping through most nights in stretches that allowed Ethan to function like a semi-normal human being. But success brought its own complications, particularly around the question of sustainability. Victoria's milk production showed no signs of decreasing, her body apparently committed to the fiction that she was nursing her own biological child, rather than someone else's son. Medical literature suggested that continued stimulation could maintain lactation indefinitely, that women throughout history had served as wet nurses for years if demand remained consistent. The implication was clear. This arrangement could continue as long as they wanted it to, which raised questions neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Late one Friday evening, after Mason had dozed off and Victoria was gathering her things to leave, Ethan finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. What happens when this stops being just about feeding Mason? When it becomes something more complicated than a practical arrangement? Victoria froze, with her bag half packed, her back to Ethan, and the silence that filled the apartment felt heavy with implications neither of them had been willing to name aloud until now. I don't know, she admitted, turning to face him with an expression that mixed fear and hope in ways that probably mirrored his own tangled feelings. I know we said this was just about Mason's nutrition, just a temporary solution to a medical crisis. But somewhere along the way it became the most important part of my day. The thing I look forward to more than anything happening at work or anywhere else in my life. Ethan stood, closing the distance between them until only a few feet separated their positions in the small living room where they'd spent 4 weeks building something that didn't fit any category either of them understood. You're my boss. You're 14 years older than me. Everyone would say I'm taking advantage, or you're abusing your power, or this whole situation is completely inappropriate. Victoria held his gaze, not flinching from the uncomfortable truth in his words. I know all of that. Know what it would look like if anyone found out, how it would destroy both our careers and probably get me removed as CEO. But I also know that I've never felt more like myself than I do here, in this cramped apartment with you and Mason, doing something that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share or any of the metrics that supposedly define success. The vulnerability in her admission broke something loose in Ethan's chest, some final resistance to acknowledging what had been growing between them alongside the practical arrangement about feeding his son. I think I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words emerging quiet but clear, carrying weight that seemed to fill the entire apartment. I know that's insane. I know it complicates everything. But I can't keep pretending this is just about Mason when you're the first person I've wanted to see every day since Keisha died. Victoria closed the remaining distance, her hand finding his with a tentative touch that asked permission while offering connection. I've been in love with you for 2 weeks. Tried to deny it, tried to convince myself this was just about filling the void Emma left, but that's not what this is. You make me feel seen in ways nobody has since before I became successful enough that people only saw the company or the money or the reputation. Ethan pulled her into an embrace that felt simultaneously natural and earth-shattering, Victoria's frame fitting against his in ways that suggested they'd been moving toward this moment since she'd walked into his apartment 4 weeks ago. They stood holding each other while Mason slept peacefully in the bedroom, while the Seattle night settled over the city outside, while everything they'd been carefully not discussing finally found expression in physical contact that promised complications neither of them could fully anticipate. We can't do this at work, Ethan said into her hair, breathing in whatever expensive shampoo she used that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Can't give anyone ammunition to claim this is about power dynamics or favoritism. Victoria pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression serious despite the tears gathering at the corners. Complete professionalism at the office. No special treatment, no acknowledgement of anything happening outside working hours. If anything, I should probably be harder on you than other engineers to avoid any appearance of preferential treatment. They both recognized the inherent absurdity of negotiating professional boundaries while standing in an embrace that had already demolished most conventional definitions of appropriate executive-employee relationships. But the attempt itself mattered, the effort to establish rules that might protect them if this situation eventually exploded in their faces. Ethan kissed her then, tentative at first, and then with growing confidence as Victoria responded with equal intensity. 4 weeks of accumulated tension finding release in physical connection that felt overdue and terrifying in its implications. They kissed like people who'd been denying themselves something essential, who'd finally stopped fighting against what they both wanted despite all the rational arguments against pursuing it. When they finally separated, breathing hard, Ethan recognized that they'd just crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, that this arrangement had officially become something far more complicated than a practical solution to Mason's feeding crisis. Victoria must have reached the same conclusion because she stepped back, creating physical distance while her expressions cycled through emotions too complex to name. I should go. Need to think about what this means, how we navigate it without destroying everything we've built. Ethan nodded, understanding the need for space even as part of him wanted her to stay, to keep talking through implications and complications until they'd mapped every possible consequence. But some things needed processing alone, in the quiet hours when brutal honesty became possible, without the distraction of another person's presence. Victoria gathered her things with movements that had lost their earlier efficiency, her hands slightly unsteady as she packed her bag, and checked her phone, and prepared to return to whatever penthouse apartment awaited her across the city. At the door, she paused, looking back at Ethan with an expression that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. "Same time tomorrow?" Ethan managed a smile that felt shaky but genuine. "Mason will be waiting. So will I." After she left, Ethan stood in the center of his living room processing what had just happened, what they'd just acknowledged, what doors they'd opened that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. He checked on Mason, confirming the baby slept peacefully, then moved to the window where he could see Victoria's Tesla pull out of the parking lot below, red taillights disappearing into Seattle traffic. The smart move would be pumping the brakes, establishing firm boundaries, maybe even ending the arrangement before emotional entanglement made everything impossible to untangle. But Ethan had never been good at smart when it contradicted what his heart demanded, had never learned how to want things casually or protect himself from potential devastation. He was all in or all out, committed completely or not at all. And somewhere in the last 4 weeks, he'd committed to Victoria Hayes in ways that went far beyond agreeing to let her nurse his son. Saturday brought new complications when Margaret called from Boston, her voice carrying the particular quality that meant she'd been worrying about something and finally decided intervention was necessary. "Baby, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is complicated." Ethan settled onto the couch, with Mason playing on a blanket at his feet, toys scattered in the chaos that marked weekend mornings. "What's going on, Mama?" Margaret took an audible breath, gathering courage for whatever question she'd been building toward. "Are you developing feelings for this woman? This Victoria who's been helping with Mason?" The directness of the question caught Ethan off guard, despite knowing his mother had always possessed uncomfortable accuracy when it came to reading her son's emotional states from 3,000 miles away. "What makes you ask that?" Her laugh came dry and knowing. "Ethan Antonio Thompson, I've been your mother for 28 years. I know when you're falling for someone based on how your voice changes when you talk about them. Every time you mention Victoria, you sound like you did when you first met Keisha. Like the whole world just got brighter and more complicated simultaneously." Ethan closed his eyes, accepting that lying to his mother had never worked and wouldn't start working now, despite the distance between Boston and Seattle. "I kissed her last night. Told her I was falling in love with her. She said she felt the same way." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Ethan started worrying the connection had dropped. But then Margaret spoke with the careful tone she used when delivering hard truths wrapped in love. "Baby, I understand loneliness. Understand wanting connection with someone who sees you beyond the grief and the single parenthood and all the weight you've been carrying. But this woman is your boss, has power over your career, and there's no version of this that doesn't get complicated in ways that could hurt you badly." Ethan watched Mason grab a plastic ring and try to fit it in his mouth, drooling contentedly, completely unaware that the adults around him were navigating emotional minefields. "I know all the reasons this is a bad idea, Mama. Know it could explode my career. Know the age gap means we're in different life stages. Know that starting a relationship under these circumstances is probably the worst decision I could make right now." He paused, finding words for feelings that still felt too new to articulate completely. "But she makes me feel alive again in ways I haven't felt since Keisha died. Makes me remember that I'm more than just Mason's father, more than a grief-stricken widower trying to survive. When I'm with her, I can breathe fully, instead of just taking shallow breaths to get through the day." Margaret's sigh carried 3,000 miles of maternal concern and understanding fighting for dominance. "Then I won't tell you not to pursue it, because you're a grown man who gets to make his own choices, even when those choices scare his mother. But I will tell you to be careful, to protect yourself, and to remember that Mason needs you stable more than he needs you in love." They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timelines and what Ethan would do if the situation fell apart. Margaret extracting promises about maintaining boundaries at work and having exit strategies if things deteriorated. By the time they hung up, Ethan felt both supported and more anxious about the path he'd chosen, his mother's concerns adding weight to worries he'd been trying to suppress through sheer force of optimism. The relationship shifted into something Ethan could only describe as cautiously optimistic over the following 3 weeks. Victoria continuing her evening visits while they navigated the delicate balance between professional distance at work and growing intimacy at home. At Innovate Tech, they maintained perfect formality, Victoria walking past Ethan's desk without acknowledgement during her occasional sweeps through the engineering floor, Ethan attending all-hands meetings where she delivered quarterly projections with the same ice-cold precision that had earned her reputation. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual, which suggested their performance was convincing, or their colleagues were too absorbed in their own concerns to register subtle changes in executive-employee dynamics. But the facade required constant vigilance, mental energy spent monitoring every interaction for signs that might trigger curiosity or suspicion. Ethan found himself avoiding casual conversations about his personal life, deflecting questions about weekend plans or evening activities with vague responses that probably made him seem antisocial, but protected the secret, consuming increasingly large portions of his attention. The stress of maintaining dual realities began showing in small ways, insomnia creeping back despite Mason's improved sleep patterns, a tightness in his shoulders that persisted even after the baby went down for the night. 3 months into the arrangement, Dr. Morrison's office called, requesting an urgent appointment to discuss Mason's development, the receptionist's tone suggesting this wasn't a routine check-in. Ethan drove to the clinic with anxiety building in his chest, watching Mason babble contentedly in the rearview mirror while imagining worst-case scenarios about mysterious health conditions that weight gain had temporarily masked. The waiting room felt oppressive, despite its cheerful pediatric decor. Cartoon animals painted on walls that probably looked welcoming to most parents, but struck Ethan as mockingly innocent, given the gravity radiating from the receptionist's earlier call. Dr. Morrison greeted them with his usual professional warmth, but his expression carried something new, a mixture of satisfaction and concern that Ethan couldn't quite decode. The examination proceeded normally, Mason tolerating the stethoscope and ear checks with minimal fussing, until the doctor pulled up growth charts on his computer and rotated the monitor so Ethan could see the trajectory that had transformed over 3 months from dangerously low to impressively robust. "Ethan, I need to ask you some direct questions about Mason's nutrition, and I need completely honest answers, regardless of how unconventional the situation might be." The phrasing sent ice through Ethan's veins, the careful neutrality suggesting Dr. Morrison had drawn conclusions that demanded confirmation rather than speculation. "What are you asking?" The doctor leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them with that meticulous precision that bought time for difficult conversations. Mason's weight gain over the past 12 weeks has been extraordinary. We're talking about moving from the 5th percentile to the 50th, a trajectory that's nearly impossible to achieve with formula alone, regardless of brand or feeding schedule. His muscle tone, skin quality, cognitive development, all showing improvements consistent with exclusive breastfeeding from a healthy, lactating mother. Ethan felt his throat constrict, knowing where this conversation was heading, but uncertain how to navigate it without exposing details that could destroy everything. "The woman I mentioned before, the one who experienced recent pregnancy loss, she's been continuing to nurse Mason. Her milk production hasn't decreased like we expected." Doctor Morrison replaced his glasses, his gaze direct but non-judgmental. "Is this arrangement sustainable long-term? Because if Mason becomes fully dependent on breast milk and the supply suddenly stops, the transition back to formula could be traumatic, given his previous rejection patterns. The question Ethan had been avoiding for weeks suddenly demanded immediate attention, forcing him to confront uncertainties about Victoria's body and their relationship, and how long this impossible situation could continue before biology or circumstances intervened. "I don't know. We're taking it week by week, hoping her body continues cooperating." The doctor made notes in Mason's chart, his expression revealing nothing about whether he approved or disapproved of this unconventional feeding arrangement. From a purely medical standpoint, what's happening is working beautifully for Mason's development. From a practical standpoint, you need contingency plans in case the situation changes suddenly. Introducing small amounts of solid food might help ease any eventual transition. Give him alternative nutrition sources beyond exclusive breastfeeding. They discussed timelines for introducing purees and cereals, strategies for gradual weaning that might protect Mason if Victoria's milk dried up unexpectedly. But underneath the practical planning, Ethan heard the unspoken concern about building dependency on something inherently unstable, about structuring a baby's nutrition around variables nobody could control or predict with confidence. That evening, Ethan raised Dr. Morrison's concerns with Victoria while she settled into the rocking chair with Mason already latched and nursing with his usual focused intensity. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through emotions that ranged from defensive to worried as Ethan outlined the sustainability questions and contingency planning recommendations. "My body shows no signs of stopping," Victoria finally responded, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear beneath the surface confidence. "I pump during lunch at work to maintain supply. Do everything lactation consultants recommend to keep production consistent. Unless something catastrophic happens, I should be able to continue indefinitely." Ethan heard the qualifier embedded in that assurance, the acknowledgement that catastrophic events did happen, that Victoria's history included 4 pregnancies ending in catastrophe when everything suggested they shouldn't. Building Mason's entire nutritional framework around her body meant accepting risk that formula, for all its inadequacies, didn't carry. "We should start introducing solids like Dr. Morrison suggested, not to replace you, but to give Mason alternatives in case your supply changes." Victoria's expression flickered with something that looked like hurt before settling back into careful neutrality. "Of course, whatever's best for Mason." The tension that entered the room suggested they'd touched something deeper than feeding logistics. Some fear Victoria carried about becoming dispensable once her primary function could be replaced by jars of puree and rice cereal. Ethan recognized the insecurity because he'd felt it himself during those early months when Mason's rejection of formula made Ethan feel fundamentally inadequate as a father, incapable of providing the most basic sustenance his child required. "This isn't about replacing you," Ethan clarified, moving to kneel beside the rocking chair so they could maintain eye contact while Mason nursed. "It's about protecting him if something happens that neither of us can control. You're not just a milk source, Victoria. You're his godmother, the person who saved his life when nobody else could. And nothing about introducing solid food changes that." Victoria's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, nodding acceptance even as her body language revealed ongoing struggle with the implications. "I know. I just keep waiting for the moment this all falls apart. For my body to fail the way it's failed at everything else related to motherhood." The fact that nursing Mason works feels like borrowed time, like I'm getting something I don't deserve, and eventually the universe will notice the accounting error and take it back. The vulnerability in her admission broke Ethan's heart, exposing how deeply Victoria's repeated losses had eroded her ability to trust good things when they appeared. He covered her free hand with his own, squeezing gently while searching for words that might penetrate the fear. "You deserve this. Deserve to experience motherhood, even if it's not in the conventional way you imagined." Mason is thriving because of you, and that's not an accounting error or borrowed time. That's you giving something precious to a baby who desperately needed it. They sat together while Mason finished nursing and dozed off, the apartment quiet except for the distant sounds of city traffic filtering through walls that felt increasingly inadequate to contain the life Ethan was building here. When Victoria finally transferred the sleeping baby to his crib and returned to the living room, she moved directly into Ethan's arms, seeking comfort in physical contact that had become as essential as the feeding arrangement that brought them together. "I'm terrified of losing this," Victoria whispered against his chest. "Losing you and Mason, and this feeling of being needed for something beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder value." Ethan held her tighter, understanding the fear because he carried his own version, anxiety about what would happen when their secret inevitably leaked, or when Victoria's body stopped cooperating, or when the inherent instability of their arrangement finally collapsed under its own weight. "Then we make the most of what we have right now. Today. Stop borrowing tomorrow's problems and focus on the fact that tonight, Mason is healthy and we're together, and that's enough." The philosophy sounded better than it probably was. Borrowed optimism masking genuine concern about sustainability. But sometimes borrowed optimism was all anyone had, when the alternative was drowning in catastrophic what-ifs that might never materialize. The crisis Ethan had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning, 4 months into their arrangement, delivered via an email from TechCrunch that pinged his phone at 7:30 while he was preparing Mason's morning bottle of supplemental formula. The subject line read, "Ice Queen's Secret. Innovate Tech CEO spotted in unexpected location." And Ethan's stomach dropped before he even opened the message to see the photographs someone had taken of Victoria entering his apartment building 3 evenings in a row. Time-stamped images that proved pattern rather than coincidence. The article didn't know about Mason, didn't understand the actual nature of Victoria's visits, but it didn't need accurate information to cause catastrophic damage. The speculation alone was enough. Paragraphs wondering about inappropriate relationships between executives and subordinates. Questions about whether this represented abuse of power or favoritism that violated Innovate Tech's ethics policies. Ethan's name wasn't mentioned, the journalist apparently unable to identify which specific apartment Victoria had been visiting. But that protection felt temporary, a brief reprieve before someone connected the dots and his identity became public knowledge. Victoria's text arrived 30 seconds later, 3 words that conveyed volumes. "We need to talk." Ethan called his mother, explained the situation in rapid sentences while simultaneously getting Mason dressed and fed, Margaret's voice on speaker providing the grounding presence he desperately needed while his world tilted sideways. "Baby, you knew this was a possibility when you started this arrangement. The question now is how you handle it. Whether you tell the truth or let speculation fill the vacuum." Ethan hadn't considered telling the truth as a viable option, had assumed their only play was denial and misdirection, but his mother's suggestion made him pause mid-diaper change. "If we tell the truth, Victoria loses her job. The board won't tolerate a CEO in this kind of situation, regardless of the actual facts." Margaret's response came firm and certain. "Maybe. Or maybe honesty buys you more grace than lies. Maybe people understand grief and loss and desperate measures better than you think. Either way, you can't control the outcome, only whether you face it with integrity or deception." The advice settled in Ethan's chest with uncomfortable weight, demanding he consider options that felt terrifying in their potential consequences. He finished dressing Mason, grabbed the overstuffed backpack that contained everything a baby might need during a workday, and headed to Innovate Tech with his phone already lighting up with messages from colleagues asking if he'd seen the article, if he knew anything about what was happening with Victoria. The office felt electric with gossip when Ethan arrived, Engineers clustered around computer screens, reading the TechCrunch piece and offering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Nobody connected him to the story yet, his anonymity providing temporary shelter from the speculation storm. But Ethan knew that protection wouldn't last. Someone would remember seeing Victoria near his desk, or notice she left around the same time he did, or piece together fragments that individually meant nothing, but collectively told an accurate story. Victoria's emergency all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. The entire company summoned to the main auditorium for an announcement that the calendar invite described only as critical company update. Ethan attended because absence would draw more attention than presence. Settling into a back row with Mason strapped to his chest in the carrier, trying to project calm he absolutely didn't feel, while the auditorium filled with employees speculating loudly about whether they were getting acquired or going public or experiencing some other corporate upheaval. Victoria walked onto the stage at 10 precisely, her posture rigid with the control Ethan recognized from moments when she was barely holding herself together through sheer force of will. She wore her trademark severe black suit, hair pulled into that painfully tight bun, every inch the Ice Queen CEO who'd built a billion-dollar company through strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. But Ethan could see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the podium, the tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently. Many of you have seen the TechCrunch article that published this morning, Victoria began, her voice projected through speakers that carried it to every corner of the packed auditorium. The article speculates about inappropriate relationships and ethics violations based on photographs of me visiting an employee's residence over several months. I'm here to address those speculations directly, rather than allowing rumor and misinformation to fill the vacuum. The room went completely silent. 1,500 employees collectively holding their breath while Victoria prepared to detonate whatever bomb she'd assembled. 4 months ago, I experienced my 4th pregnancy loss. My daughter Emma died at 18 weeks gestation, the latest in a series of miscarriages that have defined my attempts at motherhood for the past 6 years. In the immediate aftermath, my body continued producing milk due to sustained pregnancy hormones, a biological response that occurs in some women following late-term loss. Victoria paused, her hands gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles went white, and Ethan felt his own breathing stop as he realized what she was about to reveal. At the same time, one of our engineers was struggling with his 8-month-old son who had severe feeding difficulties, rejecting all formula brands and dropping to dangerously low weight percentiles that threatened to require hospitalization. When I held this baby, my body responded by letting down milk, and the infant nursed for the first time since his mother's death during childbirth 8 months prior. The collective gasp that rippled through the auditorium felt like a physical force, shock radiating outward as employees processed information that violated every assumption about their CEO's private life. Ethan held Mason closer, the baby mercifully sleeping through a moment that was about to expose them both to scrutiny neither had chosen. I've spent the last 4 months serving as wet nurse to this employee's child, visiting his home each evening to breastfeed an infant who was literally starving because his body couldn't tolerate artificial nutrition. This arrangement has been conducted with full medical supervision, with the knowledge and approval of the baby's pediatrician, and with absolute professional boundaries maintained at all times within this workplace. Victoria's voice cracked slightly on the final sentence, emotion breaking through the clinical delivery, and Ethan watched her visibly gather herself before continuing. There is no romantic relationship, no abuse of power, no favoritism in hiring or promotion or compensation. There is only a woman who lost her 4th child trying to experience at least part of motherhood by helping an infant who desperately needed what her body could provide. The silence in the auditorium had transformed from shocked to something else, a collective processing that Ethan couldn't quite read from his position in the back row. He scanned faces around him, seeing expressions that ranged from sympathy to disgust to confusion. Employees struggling to reconcile the Ice Queen CEO with this vulnerable woman confessing intimate loss and unconventional choices. I am resigning as CEO, effective immediately, Victoria continued, the words landing like physical blows. Not because I believe I did anything wrong, but because I understand that this situation compromises my ability to lead effectively, regardless of the actual facts. The board has already accepted my resignation, and interim leadership will be announced within the hour. Ethan felt the world tilt. Everything he'd feared condensing into reality as Victoria systematically destroyed her career to protect the truth about what they'd been doing. He wanted to stand up, to shout that she didn't need to do this, that they could find another way to manage the fallout. But moving would identify him as the employee in question, would expose Mason to the judgment and speculation Victoria was trying to shield them from by taking full responsibility. I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. Victoria's voice strengthened, finding power in honesty that corporate messaging had never provided. I have built this company from nothing into something that employs 1,500 people and creates value for millions of customers. I am proud of that work, proud of what we've accomplished together. But the last 4 months, nursing this baby, experiencing a shadow of what motherhood might have been, has meant more to me than any acquisition or product launch or valuation milestone. She paused, tears now visible on her face despite the bright stage lighting, vulnerability on full display for every employee watching. We build companies. We chase valuations and market share and competitive advantage. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply help another human being survive. That's what I chose to do. And I would make the same choice again, regardless of the professional cost. The auditorium erupted into chaos the moment Victoria stepped off stage, employees shouting questions that went unanswered as she disappeared through the side exit. Ethan sat frozen in his seat while people around him debated and speculated and argued about what they'd just witnessed, Mason waking up and starting to fuss against his chest. He needed to leave before someone connected the dots, needed to get out of this building before his identity became public and the speculation turned toward him. But Catherine, Victoria's assistant, appeared at his row before he could move, leaning down to whisper urgently. Miss Mintmore asks that you bring Mason to her office. She's waiting. Ethan followed Catherine through hallways that felt surreal, passing colleagues who were too absorbed in processing Victoria's announcement to notice him slipping toward the executive elevator. The 20th floor was eerily quiet, most of the C-suite executives presumably in emergency sessions with legal and PR trying to manage the fallout. Catherine ushered him into Victoria's office and closed the door, leaving Ethan alone with the woman who just sacrificed everything to protect their secret. Victoria stood by the window overlooking the bay, her back to him, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd suppressed during the public announcement. Ethan crossed to her, Mason between them, as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling her body shake with the force of released emotion. You didn't have to resign, Ethan managed, his own voice breaking. We could have found another way. Victoria turned in his arms, her face destroyed by tears and grief, and something that might have been relief underneath the devastation. Yes, I did. The board gave me an ultimatum. End the arrangement and submit to ethics investigation, or resign immediately. I couldn't end this. Couldn't abandon Mason when he's still dependent on me. Couldn't walk away from the only thing that's made me feel human in years. She reached for Mason, taking him from Ethan's arms and holding him close while fresh tears streamed down her face. I built an empire, Ethan. Created something that will outlast me and employ thousands of people and generate billions in value. But I couldn't create life. Couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. Couldn't be a mother in the way I desperately wanted. Her voice dropped to a whisper, raw with pain that went back years. This baby? Your son gave me the only taste of motherhood I'll probably ever experience. How could I choose corporate leadership over that? How could I prioritize a job title over the chance to be needed by someone who doesn't care about my net worth or market position? Ethan understood then that this hadn't been a choice for Victoria. Not really. That her decision to resign had been inevitable the moment the board forced her to pick between professional reputation and personal meaning. She'd spent 6 years chasing motherhood through fertility treatments and repeated loss, had built walls of professional achievement around the emptiness where children should have been, and Mason had finally given her access to the things she actually wanted beneath all the corporate success. What happens now? Ethan asked, the question encompassing so many uncertainties he couldn't articulate individually. Victoria wiped her eyes, attempting to compose herself while still holding Mason close.
Now I figure out who I am without the CEO title. Start the foundation I've been planning for years to help women dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss. Continue being Mason's godmother and wet nurse for as long as my body cooperates. She met Ethan's gaze directly, vulnerability mixing with determination. And if you'll have me, I'd like to try building something real with you.
Not a secret arrangement we hide from the world, but an actual relationship where we figure out what this is and where it's going. Ethan felt something unlock in his chest, permission to want this fully instead of carefully, to pursue Victoria without the constant fear of professional consequences, now that those consequences had already materialized. I love you, he said simply, the declaration feeling simultaneously overdue and perfectly timed. Have loved you for weeks, but was too scared to say it clearly. You gave up everything for Mason, for me, and I don't know how to process that level of sacrifice. Victoria kissed him then, proper and deep, Mason squirming between them but tolerating the contact with his usual good nature. When they separated, Victoria was smiling, despite the tears, something lighter in her expression than Ethan had seen during all their careful evening visits. I didn't give up everything. I gave up a job that was slowly killing me, that demanded I be someone I'm not, that required suppressing everything that makes me human. What I got in return is worth infinitely more. The following 48 hours passed in a blur of media attention that transformed Victoria from Ice Queen CEO to polarizing figure in debates about motherhood, corporate leadership, and the boundaries of appropriate workplace relationships. The initial TechCrunch article spawned hundreds of follow-ups, op-eds arguing both sides, think pieces about wet nursing and modern parenting and women's bodies. Ethan's identity leaked within 24 hours. His LinkedIn profile suddenly flooded with connection requests from journalists, and his apartment building besieged by photographers hoping for images of him and Victoria together. Margaret flew out from Boston despite her heart condition, arriving with enough motherly concern and practical support to help Ethan navigate the chaos. She took one look at Victoria when they finally met properly, the former CEO showing up at Ethan's apartment for the evening feeding while camera flashes went off in the parking lot below, and pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to make Victoria cry again.
Thank you for saving my grandson,
Margaret said simply when they separated. Thank you for loving him enough to give up everything. The public response split sharply along predictable lines, conservative commentators condemning the arrangement as inappropriate regardless of circumstances, progressive voices celebrating Victoria's choice to prioritize personal meaning over corporate achievement. But underneath the political noise, something unexpected emerged. Support from mothers who'd struggled with breastfeeding or infant feeding difficulties, women sharing stories about wet nursing arrangements that had saved their children, acknowledgement that sometimes survival required unconventional solutions. 3 weeks after Victoria's resignation, a producer from a major morning show reached out, requesting an interview. Ethan and Victoria debated the wisdom of further exposure, ultimately deciding that controlling their narrative mattered more than hiding from ongoing speculation. The interview aired on a Tuesday morning, both of them sitting on a studio couch while Mason played between them, answering questions about how they'd met, why Victoria had agreed to nurse someone else's child, what their relationship had become in the aftermath of public exposure. The host, a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on empathetic but probing interviews, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Victoria, you were one of the most powerful CEOs in Silicon Valley. You gave that up for a baby who isn't biologically yours, for a relationship that violates conventional boundaries. Do you regret it? Victoria looked at Mason, then at Ethan, her expression completely open in ways the Ice Queen would never have allowed. I spent 6 years and over $400,000 trying to have a biological child. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a piece of my soul I'll never get back. I built a billion-dollar company thinking that achievement would fill the void, that professional success would compensate for not being a mother. She paused, choosing words carefully. Nursing Mason taught me that meaning doesn't come from valuations or market share. It comes from being needed by someone who doesn't care about your accomplishments, who just wants you present and available, and willing to give them what they require to survive. I don't regret giving up the CEO position. I regret that it took me 42 years and 4 dead children to understand what actually mattered. The interview went viral within hours, clips circulating on social media with commentary that ranged from supportive to vicious. But Ethan noticed something shifting in the overall discourse. Mothers coming forward with stories about cross-nursing and milk sharing. Medical professionals defending the practice as safe and beneficial when done with appropriate screening. The shame and scandal that initially dominated coverage began giving way to more nuanced discussion about different paths to motherhood, about how grief could intersect with joy in ways that defied conventional categories. Dr. Morrison called a week after the interview aired, his voice carrying satisfaction Ethan hadn't heard in their previous conversations. I've received over 300 calls from mothers asking about wet nursing arrangements for babies with feeding difficulties. Your story is changing how people think about this, Ethan, making it acceptable again to seek help in ways that were normal for most of human history. The observation landed with unexpected weight, suggesting that their private arrangement had somehow become public advocacy, their survival strategy transformed into permission for other families facing similar crises. 6 months after Victoria's resignation, she officially launched the Emma's Legacy Foundation, with an initial commitment of $200 million, focused on supporting women through infertility, pregnancy loss, and alternative paths to motherhood. The foundation funded milk banks across California, provided grants for IVF treatments, offered counseling for families navigating adoption and surrogacy. Victoria poured into the work the same intensity she'd brought to building Innovate Tech, but now directed toward helping others avoid the isolation and repeated devastation she'd experienced. Ethan transitioned to a position at a smaller startup where his skills were valued, but the pressure felt manageable, where leaving at reasonable hours to help with Mason didn't mark him as insufficiently committed. The pay cut was significant, but survivable, and the reduced stress made him a better father and partner than he could have been while grinding through 80-hour weeks at Innovate Tech. Mason thrived, his development accelerating in ways that suggested the early feeding difficulties hadn't caused lasting damage. He started walking at 11 months, speaking his first words shortly after, growing into a cheerful toddler who split his attachment equally between Ethan and Victoria. The nursing continued until Mason was 15 months old, when Victoria's supply finally began decreasing and solid foods had largely replaced breast milk in his diet. The transition was gradual and gentle, Victoria's body slowly relinquishing a function it had maintained far longer than medical literature suggested was typical. On a Saturday morning 18 months after that first shocking discovery in the 20th floor break room, Ethan found himself at Seattle City Hall, with a small group assembled for a wedding nobody had expected when this journey began. Victoria wore a simple cream dress, her hair down and natural, no trace of the Ice Queen remaining in the woman smiling at him while they exchanged vows, witnessed by Margaret, a few close friends, and Mason in a tiny suit acting as ring-bearer with enthusiastic incompetence. The ceremony was brief and intimate, focusing on the journey that brought them here rather than conventional wedding script. When the officiant pronounced them married, Ethan kissed his wife, while their son giggled and clapped. And everything that had seemed impossible 2 years ago crystallized into a reality more meaningful than anything Ethan could have planned or predicted. "I still can't believe this worked," Ethan whispered against Victoria's hair during their first dance at the tiny reception in a restaurant they'd rented for the afternoon. "That we survived the scandal and built something real." Victoria pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression radiant in ways that had nothing to do with makeup or strategic image management. "We survived because we stopped pretending, stopped hiding what we needed and who we were, and what mattered beyond professional reputation. Turns out, honesty and vulnerability are more powerful than any corporate strategy." Later that evening, after guests had departed and Mason was sleeping peacefully at Margaret's hotel room, Ethan and Victoria sat on the couch in what was now their shared apartment, larger than his original place but still modest by standards Victoria could easily afford. "Do you miss it?" Ethan asked, the question encompassing Innovate Tech and the CEO title and the power that came with leading a billion-dollar company. Victoria considered seriously, not offering easy platitudes but genuine reflection. "I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes, the satisfaction of solving complex problems, but I don't miss the person I had to become to succeed in that world. Don't miss the isolation or the constant performance or the way achievement never actually filled the emptiness." She shifted to face him more directly, her hand finding his. "Mason saved my life, Ethan. Not metaphorically or dramatically, but actually saved me from a path that was destroying me slowly. He gave me permission to want something beyond professional success, to acknowledge that building companies wasn't what I actually needed." Ethan understood, having traveled his own version of that journey, learning that being a good father mattered more than impressing managers or climbing corporate ladders. They sat together in comfortable silence, the city lights visible through windows that overlooked a neighborhood where actual families lived instead of tech millionaires, where children played in parks and people knew their neighbors' names. Mason woke them at 6 the next morning, having been delivered back by Margaret, who had her own flight to Boston to catch. The toddler climbed into bed between them, demanding breakfast with the imperious tone of someone who knew he was loved unconditionally by the two people who'd fought so hard to keep him healthy and thriving. Victoria scooped him up, carrying him toward the kitchen while Ethan followed, the three of them moving through morning routines that had become familiar through repetition. This was what they'd chosen when Victoria resigned from Innovate Tech, when Ethan accepted a position with lower pay but better balance, when they decided that building a family mattered more than maintaining the careers that had defined them before grief and circumstance created unexpected opportunities. Not everyone understood their choices. Not everyone approved of how they'd navigated those impossible early months. But understanding and approval from outsiders had never been the point. Watching Victoria make pancakes while Mason banged on his high-chair tray demanding immediate breakfast, Ethan felt gratitude for the unlikely path that brought them here, for the grief that intersected in ways neither could have predicted, for a baby's desperate hunger meeting a woman's equally desperate need to nurture. They'd built something real from broken pieces, had created family from circumstances that should have remained professional boundaries, had found love in the last place either expected to discover it. The world might debate whether their arrangement had been appropriate or scandalous or revolutionary, but for the three people eating breakfast together in a Seattle apartment while morning light streamed through east-facing windows, the only thing that mattered was that they'd survived, they'd found each other, and they'd built something worth more than any corporate valuation or professional title could measure.